Welcome to the Get Published podcast, sponsored by Brodie Consulting Group. To get more information about our publishing and coaching services, go to getpublishedpodcast.com. Hello, I am Paul Brodie, and thank you for joining us for another episode of the Get Published podcast, where we help authors get published with a proven system that works. Today, we are being joined by James Keppel, author of See You Soon. James, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks for having me.
You ready to get started?
Yep.
All right, question number one. What is the one piece of advice that you would give to a first-time author who is currently writing their book?
Well, I've written some fiction, but just to frame this, I'm mostly a nonfiction guy, so I believe that the most important thing is to have a point of view and kind of shove it down people's throats. You know, whether they like it or not, it doesn't matter. But you know, if you have that point of view and you stick to it, I've found that to be a very effective tool. So my advice to people who are in the nonfiction business, or even in the fiction business, whatever you decide that point of view, that attitude is, just be relentless about it.
So essentially you're saying just, those that have a strong view about something, stick to your guns, don't try to please everyone, just be real and be authentic is what it sounds like.
Yeah, you're never going to please everyone. Hopefully you draw interest in whatever your point of view is, but if you waver and you're not tenacious about it, it seems to me to be very very not authentic, I guess is the way to put it.
I got you. Well, what do you feel is the hardest part about getting published?
I don't see it as being hard. And, I've had friends who have done commercial publishing, and that seems very hard. But there are so many other channels to publish now than there were 5-10 years ago that you sort of don't need to do the commercial publishing unless you're trying to get on the New York Times bestseller list or whatever. My approach is to share knowledge, and I have a big enough network that I can put it out on LinkedIn, and everybody will read it. I can print it myself. I can do all those things. If a commercial publisher came along, then that would be a different discussion. But publishing now seems to be fairly easy. I've never gone the commercial publishing route, so I can't really comment about that. But everything that I've heard about it, it just sort of doesn't interest me.
So with your books, they're all self-published, is that correct?
Yeah. There's one that I'm a fiction piece that I wrote about 10 years ago that I just couldn't release at the time, that has some commercial interest, but we'll see how that plays out. So, the answer to your question is it doesn't seem to be that hard to me. It's a business transaction.
Yeah.
You've got Gumroad, and you've got all these other places you can put things out. You can sell it yourself. You can do all that kind of stuff. So, I often hear from my author friends, getting published is the hardest part because you have to do these 10 things. I'm like, well, why are you doing that? Put it out a different way. It's more the get it out there and worry about what happens later.
I agree. I mean, it's really, in my view, there's nothing difficult about getting your book published. It's just so many different things can be very tedious. There's so many little steps involved, but nothing difficult. Just so many different steps that you got to follow when you're getting your book out there.
Yeah, I have a friend who did a commercially published book on design, and it took her 4 years to get it published. It took her about 4 months to get it written. So why I don't personally see that's the only road, but it works for some people and doesn't work for others.
Well, let's talk a little bit about marketing. Please share a marketing strategy that you have used in your book launches that has worked well.
Mine has been being out there and talking about the topics, and again, it's all nonfiction stuff. So, what I write about is urban design and planning and guest experiences and that sort of thing. And I guess the marketing strategy that I found to be most successful was to understand who your market is. So, for example, I do a lot of work in sports and entertainment. And the way that works in the United States and the way that it works in Europe are completely different. We're building $2.8 billion football stadiums once every 5 years or whatever. And in Europe, they're building 100 soccer stadiums a year. And for me, it was very easy to see that they got it much more than the way we do it here. So instead of the $2.8 billion stadium that everybody's got to raise money for, and you have to work with the cities and all that kind of stuff, you go to Europe, and in Barcelona, they're building for $660 million something that's 10 times better, and they already have the money. So I just looked at it as I'll do things that I need to do in the United States, go out and speak and that sort of thing, but really the positive reaction has been Europe. I did a small speaking tour. I went to Madrid and Barcelona and Finland, and it just worked. I mean, I got way more attention by being in those places than I would if I went to Inglewood. So my strategy has been make sure that I'm in the places that I need to be, talking to the people that are most going to understand what I'm talking about. And obviously, selling books to make a living is really not going to get it done. But the book creates the speaking engagements, and I tell them it's going to cost $6,000 in travel, and they're like, okay, whatever. So that's been my strategy. It's just been to be out there, be talking. I teach, and that has worked well for me.
Well, so what are your strategies to be able to speak at these different events that you're talking about, and especially with going over to Europe? What is your strategy, and how do you actually get those type of events arranged?
I've had publicists over time. I'm between them right now. I'm trying to find somebody new, but it's basically, I know about this conference, call them and get me the gig. And it's been fairly simple because in Europe they want the U.S. sort of influence, and that's kind of exotic for them, but they're not afraid to pay for it either. So it's been fairly easy. I tried to get a speaking engagement in Monterey, and I couldn't get it, and then called Barcelona that afternoon, and all of a sudden I'm there. So
It's funny how things work. So you mentioned you utilized a publicist, but right now you're not utilizing a publicist. Is that correct?
Yeah, she was a one person operation, and she ended up taking a job somewhere. So I'm trying to find somebody new, but it was a low investment kind of thing, and her job was to make these phone calls. That was really it.
Cool. Thank you for sharing that. And the reason I asked that, PR and hiring publicists is being one of the areas that we've touched on briefly in the show. So I really appreciate you adding that insight.
Yeah, I found it to be very effective. You have to have the right person, and you have to have the budget to do it. And publicists used to cost $10,000 a month, whether they did something or not, and now they don't cost that much. So it's it's a very different world than it was 5 or 10 years ago.
Well, James, I want to transition and now talk about your favorite book. So what is your favorite book, and what was the number one thing that you learned from it?
My favorite book that I have probably read 50 times at this point, it's called Getting Real, and it's put out by some software developers who have a project management software platform called Basecamp. Company used to be called 37 Signals, and even though they're developing software and the book is about software, there's something about their attitude that just really resonates with me. So Jason Fried is one of the founders. You can find him on TED Talks and that sort of thing. They've written a number of other books, but they just have this attitude about how you work that I think is really interesting. And Getting Real was all about getting out what they called the MVP, your minimum viable product. Just get something out there, get your customers to react to it, and then figure out what you do next, as opposed to putting it out in the world and saying, this is it, take it or leave it. So Getting Real, I give it to every one of my clients, and I tell them if they won't read that, please don't hire me, because it's just about making things happen.
I'm going to have to write down that book. I'm writing it down right now. Get Real. I'll check it out.
Getting Real, and they have another one called Rework, which is really interesting. And the way that they operate is they have an office, but most of the people work like all around the world from their homes, and their attitude is that meetings are the death of anything you can do.
You are preaching to the choir, James. You are preaching to the choir. I have always hated meetings, so I'm glad you brought that up.
Right. Well, Jason's talk on TEDx, I watched it this morning preparing for this call. It's just about how much time you waste not actually getting any work done because you went to the office.
Mm-hmm.
and it's always resonated with me.
Well, and I have a polarizing viewpoint with that too, because don't get me wrong, there are some meetings that are good, but most of the meetings that I experienced when I was in the corporate world and when I was in education, it was just so the main person could hear themselves talk. Now, how's that for a polarizing viewpoint?
Well, that's pretty much what they're talking about too. They're saying that no employees get together and say we're going to have a meeting. The managers have a meeting so that they can act like they're doing something. And I'm just a cowboy, so I like to hear those kind of views, that they are so non-corporate and their business is wildly successful and has been for a very long time. So they're software guys, but you can apply their ideas basically anywhere. So that book has always struck me.
Yeah, I always joke around back when I was in the corporate world and education. I was, you know what? They should have more meetings by having less meetings.
Well, Google used to have a rule that you couldn't have anybody who was over 30 years old in a meeting. I don't know if they still do. I don't know if they still do that, but that was an interesting concept too.
Well, let's talk about your favorite quote for a final question. So, what is your favorite quote and why?
I've got two that I use over and over again, and they're very much related. And the two people that gave the quotes are as diametrically opposed as you can imagine, but they're both geniuses. So the first one was Albert Einstein, and he said, creativity is intelligence having fun.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that one because it just sort of lets you think, okay, you're smart and all that sort of stuff, but you have to be creative too. The other one is from Frank Zappa.
Nice.
And Frank Zappa said, "The mind is like a parachute. It only works when it's open."
He's exactly correct too.
Yeah, so I always put those two together, just because they're about the expansion of thinking and not the narrow thinking that we often can fall into if we're not careful.
I couldn't agree with you more. Well, James, I want to thank you for being a guest on the show. What is the best way for people to find you online?
I'm pretty much everywhere. I was thinking about that question, and I was going to say MySpace, but that...
Oh, no. The internet's abandoned amusement park.
Exactly. My website is jkeppel.com. It's jkeppel.com. That's a good way, and I'm on LinkedIn and Twitter, and I don't use Facebook much, but... if you can't find me, you probably don't know how to use the internet.
I love it. Well, James, I want to thank you again for being a guest on the show. We've had a great time, and I want to wish you all the best in your author journey ahead.
Thank you, and thanks again for having me, and it's been fun.
Thanks again for joining us today. To learn more about how to get your book published with a proven system that works, grab a free copy of my book at getpublishedpodcast.com.